There were nearly 500 people at my sister's wedding when my mother stood up and erased me. I remember the sound first, not the faces, champagne glasses clinking, a string quartet stretching a final note too long, polite laughter floating through the warm Texas air. Then my mother lifted her glass, her smile flawless, practiced, the kind that had built her reputation for decades. "I only have one daughter," she said, her voice clear and steady, drawing soft applause from the crowd. She turned slightly, just enough to gesture toward my sister glowing in white beside her groom. The bride today, a brilliant woman with a future worth celebrating. The applause grew. Then she shifted again, barely, her eyes flicking toward the back of the room where I stood. "That thing back there," she added almost lightly, "that was a mistake we kept for too long." The room didn't react at first. It froze. My father didn't wait for it to recover. "We should have put her up for adoption when we had the chance," he said, his tone flat, certain, like he was correcting a long overdue error. No one laughed, no one moved, and I didn't cry. I just stood there, in a room full of witnesses, and realized something terrifyingly clear. This wasn't the moment my life fell apart. This was the moment everything finally began. I didn't defend myself. I didn't step forward. I didn't even look at my sister standing there bathed in approval, as if nothing had just shifted beneath all of us. Instead, I picked up my clutch, turned, and walked out without a word. The whispers started behind me before I reached the door, low and hungry, spreading from table to table like something alive. I kept walking. Not because I was strong, not because I didn't feel it, but because I had already lived through this moment in smaller ways for years. Tonight was just the first time they had decided to make it public. The gravel outside crunched under my heels as I stepped into the night, the air cooler than it had any right to be after what had just happened inside. Laughter slowly returned behind the barn doors, muffled but persistent, as if the performance could continue now that the unwanted part had been removed. I made it to my car before my hands started shaking. I gripped the handle, forcing my breathing to stay steady, counting without realizing I was doing it. 1, 2, 3. Control was something I had learned early. In my family, losing it meant losing everything else. I slid into the driver's seat and shut the door, cutting off the noise completely. For a moment, I just sat there, staring at my reflection in the rearview mirror. My makeup was still perfect, my expression calm, no tears. That was the strange thing about humiliation when it grows too large. It doesn't always break you. Sometimes it hardens into something sharper, something quieter, something that waits. I didn't start the car right away. Instead, I reached into my bag and pulled out my wallet, the leather worn from years of being carried everywhere. Inside, tucked behind cards and folded receipts, were the things that mattered. Not memories, not comfort, evidence, small pieces of a larger pattern I had been collecting for longer than anyone realized. I ran my thumb along the edge of it, grounding myself in something real, something structured, something that didn't depend on how anyone else chose to see me. My mother thought tonight was a correction, a way to fix a mistake she believed had lingered too long. What she didn't understand was that I had stopped trying to be corrected years ago. I had stopped trying to belong, and somewhere along the way I had started paying attention instead. I placed the wallet on the passenger seat and finally started the engine. The headlights cut through the long stretch of road leading away from the venue, the barn lights shrinking in the distance behind me. I didn't know exactly how everything would unfold yet, but I knew this much with absolute certainty. Tonight wasn't the end of my place in that family. It was the beginning of the end of theirs. If you were erased in front of 500 people, would you disappear quietly, or would you make sure the truth followed them home? The first time I realized I didn't belong in my own family, I was 8 years old, standing in the corner of a crowded dining room while everyone else seemed to exist in perfect alignment. My sister Emily sat at the center of the table, surrounded by laughter, wrapped gifts, and attention that moved toward her as naturally as breath. I remember holding a small box in my hands, waiting for someone to notice I hadn't been called forward yet. I kept waiting until the room began to empty, until the candles burned low, until even the noise faded into something distant. No one ever called my name. Eventually, I placed the box beside her unopened gifts and slipped out without a word. No one followed me. No one asked where I went. That was the first time I understood something I wouldn't fully accept for years. In our house, attention wasn't shared. It was assigned, and I had never been chosen. As I grew older, the pattern didn't change. It refined itself. Emily wasn't just loved more, she was curated. My mother dressed her in perfection, spoke about her as if she were already everything she needed to be, and built entire conversations around her future. I learned quickly that my role was not to compete with that, but to stay out of its way. If I spoke too much, I was difficult. If I stayed quiet, I was cold. There was no version of me that made sense inside the story they were telling. When I was 13, I won a regional science award after months of working on a project no one had helped me with. I remember standing on that stage, holding something I had built entirely on my own, scanning the audience for faces that weren't there. Later that night, I found out why. My parents had been across town celebrating Emily's acceptance into a summer program she didn't even care about. When I told my mother about the award, she smiled in that distant way she used when something didn't interest her and said, "That's nice, Catherine, but your sister has real opportunities ahead of her." That was the moment something shifted. Not outwardly, not in a way anyone could see. But internally, something small and hopeful stopped trying. There were moments like that everywhere, subtle enough to be dismissed individually, but undeniable when they were allowed to accumulate. The way my father would introduce Emily with pride and then pause when it came to me, as if deciding how little detail he could offer without drawing attention. The way guests would ask about the talented daughter, and no one ever needed clarification. The way my mother would laugh lightly and say, "Catherine is just sensitive," as if that single word explained everything inconvenient about me. By the time I was 16, I stopped trying to correct them. I stopped trying to earn something that clearly wasn't meant to be given. Instead, I started watching. That shift didn't come from strength. It came from exhaustion, from realizing that no matter how much I adjusted, it never changed the outcome. So I redirected that energy into something else. I paid attention. I listened more carefully. I noticed the way conversations changed when I entered a room, the way financial discussions stopped abruptly, the way documents were quietly moved out of sight. I began to understand that what I had always interpreted as rejection might actually be something more controlled, more deliberate. The first person who ever confirmed that thought wasn't a friend or a teacher. It was my uncle, Victor. He rarely visited, but when he did, he watched everything. I remember one evening after dinner, sitting alone outside when he joined me without saying anything at first. After a while, he asked, "Do you see what's happening here?" I didn't answer. I didn't know how to. But he nodded anyway, as if my silence had already said enough. "Pay attention," he told me quietly, "not to what they say, to what they avoid." That was the moment everything changed. After that, I stopped trying to understand my place in the family. I started trying to understand the family itself. I began keeping track of things. At first, it was small. Conversations that didn't match, reactions that felt rehearsed, details that didn't align. Then it became more structured. Notes turned into patterns. Patterns turned into questions. And those questions led me into places I don't think they ever imagined I would look. By the time I left for college, I no longer believed I was the problem. I believed I was the only one paying attention to something no one else wanted to acknowledge. Sitting in my car that night after the wedding, replaying my mother's words in my head, I realized something with absolute clarity. That moment hadn't created anything new. It had simply confirmed what had always been there. They hadn't made a mistake by keeping me. They had made one by underestimating me. By the time I stopped trying to belong, I had already started seeing too much. It didn't happen in one moment or with one discovery. It came together slowly, like something forming at the edge of your vision until you finally turn and realize it has been there all along. What began as small inconsistencies eventually revealed something structured, something deliberate, something that made my family's polished image feel less like success and more like design. The first real fracture appeared during my final year of college in Dallas. I had taken an internship at a financial consulting firm, nothing prestigious, just a way to build experience and stay away from home. One afternoon, while organizing client files, I came across a set of transaction reports tied to a charitable medical foundation. The name caught my attention immediately. It was one my father used often in speeches, always paired with words like integrity, service, community. At first, I assumed it was coincidence, but the deeper I looked, the harder it became to believe that. The numbers didn't match the narrative. Funds labeled as outreach and patient support were being redirected through layered accounts, moving in ways that didn't align with any legitimate structure. The amounts were large enough to matter, but distributed carefully enough to avoid immediate scrutiny. It wasn't obvious fraud. It was something more calculated, something designed to look clean unless you knew exactly where to look. I didn't save the files that day. I didn't report anything. I just memorized what I could and walked out with a quiet tension I couldn't explain. That night, I wrote down a question that felt heavier than it should have. What else are they hiding? The answer started to surface a few months later during a visit home. I was passing by my mother's study when I heard her voice, lower than usual, sharper, stripped of its usual composure. She hadn't noticed me, and I didn't interrupt. "I told you the next transfer would cover it," she said, pacing. "No, it's not a risk, it's structured, that's the entire point." There was a pause, then a shift in her tone, smoother, rehearsed. Of course I trust it. I wouldn't still be in if I didn't. I moved away before she could see me, but the words stayed. Structured. Still in. That night, I went back to the study when the house was quiet. I didn't search like someone looking for answers. I searched like someone confirming what they already suspected. What I found wasn't a single clear explanation. It was fragments, emails referencing private investment circles, printed summaries with projected returns that felt too precise to be real, notes written in my mother's handwriting with percentages and timelines that didn't connect to anything visible. It wasn't enough to prove anything on its own, but it didn't need to be. It fit too cleanly with what I had already seen. My father's money moved in ways that concealed intention. My mother's moved in ways that ignored consequence. Together, it formed something unstable. The last piece came from the person no one ever questioned. Emily. She had always been the center of everything, the one my parents built their image around. I used to think her confidence came from being supported, from being chosen. But the more I watched, the more I noticed the adjustments. The way she shifted details depending on who she was speaking to. The way certain stories changed just enough over time to stay convincing. The way she redirected conversations before anything uncomfortable could surface. One evening, I overheard her speaking on the phone, her voice relaxed, almost amused. "People don't need the full story," she said. "They just need the version that makes sense." There was a pause, then a quiet laugh. And I'm very good at giving them that. That was the moment everything aligned. My father controlled perception through authority. My mother controlled it through presentation. Emily maintained it through narrative. It wasn't just a family dynamic, it was a system, and I was the only part of it that didn't fit. From that point on, I stopped asking if something was wrong. I started documenting how it worked. I went back to the financial records, and this time I saved everything I could access. I tracked dates, linked transactions to events, built timelines that connected decisions to outcomes. I cross-referenced conversations with actions, patterns with results. I didn't rush. I didn't confront. I built. Because truth without structure can be dismissed, but truth with evidence becomes something else entirely. Years passed, and the system held. Publicly admired, privately unstable, and all the while they continued to treat me like the weakest part of the family, the one who couldn't handle pressure, the one who didn't belong. They never considered the possibility that I wasn't failing to fit into their world. I was studying it. So when my mother stood in front of 500 people and called me a mistake, she believed she was correcting something that didn't belong, removing the flaw in the image they had spent decades building. What she didn't realize was that I had already mapped every crack in that image, and systems like that don't collapse because someone attacks them. They collapse because someone finally shows how they were built. The night of the wedding didn't break me. It aligned me. By the time I drove back to my apartment in Austin, everything that had once felt like fragments began to settle into something structured, something deliberate. For years, I had been collecting pieces without fully committing to what they meant. That night, there was no more uncertainty. I wasn't reacting to what had happened. I was stepping into something I had already been building. I didn't turn on the lights when I walked in. I went straight to my desk, opened my laptop, and pulled up the folders I had spent years organizing. Files layered with dates, notes, cross-references, screenshots of transactions, copies of emails, timelines that connected events no one else had ever questioned. It was all there, waiting, not chaotic, not emotional, structured. The first thing I understood was that I couldn't move too fast. If I exposed anything impulsively, they would dismiss it, distort it, and rebuild the narrative around me. That was how they had always operated. Control the story before anyone else could, so I needed to do something they wouldn't expect. I needed to control the sequence. I broke the plan into 3 parts: containment, fracture, exposure. Containment meant securing everything in a way that couldn't be erased or denied. I duplicated files onto encrypted drives, backed up the most critical documents into a separate cloud account, and reorganized everything into timelines instead of categories. Every piece of information needed to support something larger. It wasn't enough to have proof. It had to be undeniable. Fracture required something else entirely. It meant understanding what each of them depended on to maintain control. My father relied on institutional authority, reputation, the assumption that his position placed him beyond scrutiny. My mother relied on perception, social standing, the illusion that everything she touched was refined and intentional. Emily relied on consistency, the ability to maintain a flawless narrative no matter the circumstance. If one of those elements broke alone, they could recover. But if all 3 fractured at once, the entire system would collapse. That meant timing had to be exact. I needed them together, confident, unguarded, and forced to respond in real time. A public confrontation would be too chaotic. A private one would be too easy to deny. I needed something controlled, but witnessed. That was when the dinner took shape. A reconciliation. Something they would believe I wanted. Something that fit the role they had assigned to me for years. The one who always came back. The one who absorbed damage quietly. The one who tried to fix what they broke. I drafted the message carefully, reading it over until it sounded exactly like the version of me they expected. I don't want things to stay like this after the wedding. Can we have dinner at my place? I think we should talk. I sent it before I could hesitate. My father responded first. We'll see. My mother didn't reply. Emily answered hours later. For everyone's sake, let's handle this like adults. I stared at that message longer than I should have. Adults. The word felt almost ironic. There had been nothing adult about what they did at that wedding, but that was the point. They believed they still defined reality. They believed I would follow it. The next step was bringing in someone who didn't. Daniel was the only person I trusted with the full scope of what I had uncovered. When I called him the next morning and said, I need you to see something, he didn't ask questions. He just came over. We spent hours going through everything, financial trails, timeline alignments, patterns that only became visible when you stopped looking at them as isolated events. At one point, he leaned back and stared at the screen, his expression tightening in a way I hadn't seen before. This isn't just questionable, he said. This is designed. I know, I replied. He looked at me then, not at the files, but at me. If you do this, there's no going back. There already isn't, I said. That was when the plan became real. Daniel suggested something I hadn't fully considered. "You need a witness," he said. "Someone who understands what this actually means. Someone who can't be manipulated by them." He recommended a colleague from compliance, someone who would recognize the implications immediately. It added risk, but it also added weight. I agreed. The rest of the day became execution. I tested the setup in my dining room, ensuring every file could be displayed clearly, every transition smooth, every sequence impossible to interrupt without consequence. I printed key documents, organized them into folders, aligned them with the digital structure. I didn't rehearse what I would say. I memorized what I needed to show. At one point, Daniel watched me moving through everything with a calm that didn't match the situation. "You've been ready for this longer than you admit," he said. I paused for a second, then continued organizing. "I think part of me always knew I would need this," I answered. "Not to hurt them, to prove that I wasn't imagining it." That night, I sat alone in the quiet, rereading their messages confirming the dinner. Everything was in place. The evidence, the timing, the witnesses, the structure. For the first time, I allowed myself to think beyond the plan. What happens after this? Not what happens to them. That part was already set in motion. What happens to me? The answer came with a clarity I hadn't expected. For the first time in my life, I wouldn't be reacting to who they said I was. I would be deciding it. And 2 nights later, when they walked into my home expecting to fix me, they would finally understand something they had never considered. I wasn't the weakest part of the family. I was the one who knew exactly how it worked. By the time Thursday evening arrived, everything looked exactly the way it was supposed to. The table was set with careful precision, neutral tones, soft lighting, nothing dramatic, nothing emotional. It was the kind of setting my mother would have approved of, controlled, tasteful, curated. I built it that way on purpose. People like my family only relax when they believe they understand the room. At 6:47 p.m., headlights stretched across the front window. I didn't feel panic. I didn't feel hesitation. What I felt was something colder, something steady. Readiness. I opened the door before they had the chance to knock. My father stepped in first, posture rigid, expression measured, already performing control. My mother followed, scanning the space in a single glance, evaluating, adjusting. Emily came last, composed as always, but there was something tighter in her expression now, something slightly misaligned. Daniel entered behind them, polite, professional, introduced simply as someone assisting me with work. No one questioned it. They never questioned what they didn't expect. For the first 10 minutes, everything unfolded exactly as predicted. Plates were passed, glasses filled, conversation floated across the table without ever landing anywhere real. My mother asked about my work with polite distance. My father commented on the house in a tone that sounded like approval but wasn't. Emily filled the gaps, smoothing every pause before it could become uncomfortable. They were waiting for me to apologize. I let them wait. My father set his fork down first, his movements controlled, deliberate. "Catherine," he said, "what happened at the wedding was unfortunate. But we're here now. Let's not turn this into something bigger than it needs to be." Unfortunate. I nodded slowly, as if considering the word. "You're right," I said. "It shouldn't become something bigger than it needs to be." I stood before anyone could respond and walked to the sideboard, picking up the tablet and placing it at the center of the table. It looked harmless. That was intentional. Emily's eyes moved to it immediately. "What is that?" she asked, her tone light but sharpened underneath. "The reason this conversation stays honest," I said, sitting back down. My father's expression shifted, just slightly. "If this is some kind of performance—" "It isn't," I said calmly. "It's structure." I tapped the screen. The display came to life with clean, precise financial projections. No accusations, no emotion, just data. Transactions layered across timelines, accounts connected in ways that didn't make sense unless you followed them closely. Funds labeled for outreach moving through channels that led somewhere else entirely. The room went quiet. Not dramatically, but tightly, like something had just been introduced that no one knew how to handle. My father leaned forward, his voice controlled but strained. "This doesn't prove anything." "It proves enough," I replied. I moved to the next sequence. Dates aligned with board decisions. Transfers tied to events my father had publicly represented. The pattern became harder to dismiss with every swipe. Emily's composure cracked first. Not visibly, not dramatically, but in the way her posture stiffened, in the way her attention sharpened. "Financial data can be misleading," she said quickly. "Out of context, it always looks worse than it is." "That would be true," Daniel said evenly, speaking for the first time, "if the context didn't match the pattern." My mother's hand tightened around her glass. "Catherine," she said, her voice softer now, almost controlled concern, "you don't understand what you're looking at." I met her eyes. "I understand exactly what I'm looking at." The shift happened then. Not outwardly, but structurally. The control they had carried into my house began to fracture. My father pushed his chair back slightly, a small movement that carried more weight than any raised voice. "Where did you get this?" he demanded. I didn't answer him. "Do you want to know what happens next?" I asked instead. No one spoke. I turned the tablet so they could see the final layer. Projected outcomes, audit triggers, regulatory pathways, the exact points where this information would move beyond this room and into systems they couldn't control. It wasn't a threat. It was a timeline. Emily stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "You're being irrational," she said, but the word didn't hold. "I'm being precise," I corrected. My mother shook her head, her composure slipping for the first time. "You're going to destroy everything." I held her gaze. "No," I said. "I'm going to show what's already there." That was the moment they understood. Not everything, not fully, but enough. This dinner had never been about reconciliation, and for the first time in their lives, they were no longer the ones deciding how the story would be told. The shift didn't come with shouting. It came with silence tightening around the table until even breathing felt too loud. For a moment, no one moved. The numbers were still on the screen, clean, undeniable, sitting between us like something alive. Then my father stood up so abruptly his chair scraped against the floor. "You're not releasing any of this," he said, his voice sharp now, stripped of diplomacy. It wasn't a question. It was the same authority he had used his entire life, the assumption that control still belonged to him. I didn't argue. I didn't need to. I turned the tablet back toward myself and tapped once. That part already happened. The sentence didn't land immediately. It hovered for a second, unprocessed. Then Emily's expression shifted, calculation breaking into something raw. "What did you do?" she asked, her voice tightening. I met her gaze without hesitation. "I completed the sequence." Daniel leaned forward slightly, calm, precise. "The files were forwarded to hospital oversight, financial regulators, and a private audit firm tracking irregularities," he said. "Everything is already in motion." My mother's glass slipped from her fingers and hit the table with a dull sound. She didn't even look at it. "You sent it out?" she whispered. "I scheduled it," I said, 2 hours before you got here." The room didn't explode. It collapsed inward. My father stepped closer, his movements sharper now, controlled anger slipping through. "Do you understand what you've done?" he demanded. "Yes," I said. "I do." He stopped a few feet away, searching for something to hold on to, authority, leverage, anything. There was nothing left. Not the narrative, not the timing, not the outcome. Emily pulled out her phone and started dialing, her movements fast, precise, almost mechanical. "Hi, this is Emily Cole," she said, forcing steadiness into her voice. "I need to confirm a contract status immediately." There was a pause, then another, longer this time. I watched her face as the color drained from it. "They've suspended it," she said finally, barely above a whisper. "They're reviewing everything." Of course they were. My mother sank into her chair, her posture folding in on itself. "This isn't real," she murmured, shaking her head slowly. This can't be happening. But it was. My father's phone rang. The sound cut through the room like something final. He hesitated before answering, but only for a second. I didn't need to hear the other side to understand. His responses were short, clipped, controlled. No denial, no argument, just acknowledgement. When he ended the call, he didn't look at me immediately. "They've opened an inquiry," he said quietly, effective immediately. My mother let out a broken breath. "Mark, fix it," she said, turning toward him. "You have to fix it." He didn't respond. Because he couldn't. Emily lowered her phone slowly, her composure gone in a way I had never seen before. "You didn't have to do this," she said, her voice strained. "We could have handled this privately." I almost smiled. "That's exactly why I didn't," I replied, "because privately, you would have rewritten it by tomorrow." That hit harder than anything else. The room fractured after that, not all at once, but in pieces. My father started talking about legal consequences, about retaliation, about things that sounded like power but felt empty. My mother moved between denial and blame, her voice rising, searching for something to hold on to. Emily tried to stabilize it, shifting from one argument to another, but nothing connected anymore. And through all of it, I stayed where I was, not watching them fall apart, just not being part of it anymore. At some point, the noise faded. Not because they stopped talking, but because it stopped mattering. I looked around the table at the people who had defined me for so long and realized something simple. They weren't powerful. They had just never been challenged. Now they were. And systems like theirs don't survive that. By the time they left, nothing had been resolved. No apology, no agreement, just fragments of control slipping through their hands as they walked out of my house. They didn't leave as a family trying to fix something. They left as individuals already losing everything they had built together. And for the first time, I wasn't part of that loss. I was the reason it existed. The fallout didn't wait. It began the next morning, quiet at first, like something shifting beneath the surface before anyone could name it. My phone lit up before I was fully awake. Missed calls, messages, numbers I recognized, and others I didn't. I didn't answer any of them. I already knew what they would say. Not apologies, not accountability, questions, demands, attempts to control something that had already moved beyond them. By noon, the pattern had taken shape. My father had been placed on immediate leave pending investigation. Not something temporary he could quietly recover from. This was formal, visible, documented. The kind of action that doesn't just threaten a position, but removes the authority behind it. People who had once stood beside him were now stepping away, not out of principle, but out of self-preservation. My mother's world unraveled differently, but just as fast. The investment circles she had built her identity around began collapsing under scrutiny. Accounts were frozen. Calls went unanswered. Invitations disappeared. The same people who had once praised her were now distancing themselves with quiet efficiency, cutting ties before association could become risk. She didn't just lose money. She lost the illusion that had protected her. Emily lasted longer. She always did. But even she couldn't hold the narrative once it stopped being contained. The sponsorship contract tied to her image was suspended. Questions were raised in rooms she no longer controlled. And then there was her husband, the one person who had married into the version of our family she had carefully constructed. That version didn't survive reality. By the end of the week, he was gone. No announcement, no confrontation, just absence. It was almost precise, the way everything collapsed, not chaotic, not emotional, structural. I watched it all from a distance, not involved, not reacting, just aware. Information came to me in fragments, messages forwarded, articles, conversations I wasn't part of but could still access. For the first time, I wasn't inside the system. I was outside it. A week after the dinner, the doorbell rang. I knew it was them before I moved. They didn't call ahead. They didn't ask. They arrived like they always had, as if presence alone was permission. When I opened the door, they were standing there together, but not as a unit. My father looked smaller, not physically, but in the way he held himself, like something essential had been removed. My mother's composure was gone, replaced by something unstable. Emily stood slightly apart, her usual control replaced by tension that felt unfamiliar on her. "You've made your point," my father said immediately, skipping everything that would have required acknowledgement. His voice was controlled, but thinner than I had ever heard it. "This has gone far enough." I leaned against the doorframe, not stepping aside. "It went far enough at the wedding," I said. My mother stepped forward, her hands trembling. "Catherine, please," she said, her voice breaking. "We've lost everything." I held her gaze. "You didn't lose everything," I replied. "You lost control." That stopped her. Emily moved next, her voice quieter, more measured, trying to rebuild something from nothing. "You can still fix this," she said. "You can clarify things. You can explain that it was taken out of context. People will listen to you." There it was. Not regret. Strategy. "What exactly would I be clarifying?" I asked. "That it isn't true? That the data is wrong? That none of it happened?" She didn't answer. Because she couldn't. My father's control snapped then, just slightly. "You're enjoying this," he said, his voice hardening. "You've been waiting for this." I considered that for a moment. "I've been waiting to stop being part of it," I said. The difference didn't register for him. Then Emily did something I had never seen before. She stepped closer, closing the space between us, and lowered herself just enough to break the position she had always held above me. Not dramatic, not performative, just enough to change the balance. "Please," she said quietly, "just tell them it's not as bad as it looks, that we can resolve it." Not an apology, a negotiation. I looked at her, really looked, and saw something that had never existed there before. Fear. "You're not here because you understand what you did," I said. "You're here because for the first time it's affecting you." Silence settled between us. My mother began to cry again, softer now, exhausted. My father looked away, his jaw tight, his authority reduced to something fragile. Emily didn't move. She just stood there, absorbing a reality she could no longer control. I straightened slightly, making my position clear without raising my voice. "You didn't lose me last week," I said. "You lost me years ago. You just didn't notice because I stayed quiet." No one argued. There was nothing left to argue. They stood there for a moment longer, as if waiting for something else, a way back, a version of this that could still be fixed. But there wasn't one. There never had been. So I closed the door. Not out of anger, not out of cruelty, but because for the first time in my life, I didn't need it to stay open. The house felt different after I closed the door on them, not quieter, not emptier, but clearer, like something that had been hanging in the air for years had finally been removed. I stood there for a moment with my hand still resting against the wood, listening to the fading sound of their footsteps as they walked away. No shouting, no last attempt to pull me back, just the slow retreat of people who had finally run out of control. I didn't feel victory. That was the part I hadn't expected. There was no rush, no satisfaction in watching everything they had built collapse under its own weight. What I felt instead was something far less dramatic, but far more real. Relief. The kind that settles into your chest when you realize you're no longer carrying something that was never yours to begin with. Over the next few days, the fallout continued, but it no longer reached me the same way. Reports spread, investigations deepened. Their names, once spoken with admiration, were now tied to questions no one could ignore. My father's position was gone. My mother's social world had evaporated. Emily's carefully constructed life had fractured beyond repair. The system they had built together didn't just weaken, it unraveled, and for the first time, I wasn't part of it. I stopped checking my phone every hour. I stopped replaying conversations in my head, searching for ways I could have said things differently, because there weren't any. The truth had existed long before I chose to expose it. All I had done was stop protecting it. A week later, I packed a suitcase, not because I was running, not because I needed to escape what had happened, but because for the first time, I had the freedom to choose where I wanted to go without calculating how it would affect them. I booked a one-way flight out of Texas, somewhere quiet, somewhere unfamiliar, somewhere that didn't carry the weight of expectations I had never agreed to. The morning I left, I walked through the house slowly, not to say goodbye, but to acknowledge what it had been. A place where I learned to stay quiet, a place where I learned to observe, a place that shaped me in ways I didn't fully understand until I no longer needed it. And standing there, I realized something that felt both simple and impossible at the same time. It didn't define me anymore. At the airport, surrounded by strangers moving in every direction, I felt something settle inside me. Not closure. Something better. Distance. The kind that lets you see things clearly without being pulled back into them. I thought about everything that had led to this moment. The years of being overlooked. The times I questioned myself instead of them. The slow shift from trying to belong to understanding why I never did. And finally, the decision to stop carrying a version of myself that had been built entirely on their expectations. They had called me a mistake, but mistakes are accidents, unintended, meaningless. I wasn't any of those things. I was the result of everything they chose to ignore, the consequence of every lie they maintained, every truth they avoided, every moment they believed there would never be a cost. And when that cost finally came, it didn't come from the outside. It came from me. As I walked toward my gate, I didn't look back. Not at the house, not at the wedding, not at the version of myself they had spent years trying to define. I didn't need to, because for the first time I wasn't trying to prove anything. I was just moving forward. If you've ever been made to feel invisible in your own story, if you've ever been told you were the problem simply for seeing the truth, I want to ask you something. Would you keep shrinking to fit a place that was never built for you? Or would you walk away and finally define yourself on your own terms? If this story stayed with you, don't leave just yet. Share your thoughts, tell me where you're watching from, and let me know what you would have done in my place. And if you want more stories like this, stories about truth, power, and what happens when silence finally breaks, stay with us and subscribe, because this is only the beginning. This story is fictional. Any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental.